Well, Sacramento County's oldest cold case has finally been solved 52 years later after a county court reporter was murdered. Authorities say they know who the suspected killer is.
On the night of October 25, 1970, while the city of Sacramento was sleeping, something incredibly sinister was brewing in the second-story bedroom of Nancy Marie Benallack's apartment. When 28-year-old Nancy failed to show up for her job at the district court the next morning, her co-workers instantly knew something was wrong. Panic set in. A worried friend asked her son, Jack, to check on Nancy. Jack rushed to the complex, convinced the hesitant apartment manager to grab the passkey, and together, they unlocked the door to apartment 17. When they stepped inside, the mundane world vanished. They were met with a gruesome, horrific nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Nancy Marie's dead body, completely covered in blood. What evil descended upon that apartment complex on that fateful night? Who could have cold-heartedly slaughtered this innocent, bright young woman just weeks before her wedding? Welcome back to Retrograde Crime, where we step back in time to pull back the curtain on history's most chilling under-the-radar mysteries. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button to join the Retro Gang. Today, we are breaking down the oldest cold case solved in 2022. Let's walk on the edge of this mystery without any further ado. To understand the sheer tragedy of what happened inside apartment 17, you have to look at the life Nancy Benallack was building. In the fall of 1970, 28-year-old Nancy was truly happy. She was well-liked, successful, and deeply settled in Sacramento. She lived in a beautiful second-story apartment complex on Arden Way and Bell Street, sharing her home with her beloved cat. Her sister, Linda, loved and adored her, constantly pampering her. But the biggest source of Nancy's joy that autumn was her fiancé, Ferris Salome. Ferris wasn't just anyone. He was the chief public defender for the Sacramento District Court. He and Nancy worked in the very same courthouse, making them a well-known, highly respected couple in the local legal community. They were young, successful, and deeply in love. In fact, their wedding date was already set for November 28, 1970, just a little over a month away. They were spending almost all their free time together, finalizing plans for their future, completely unaware that their time was running out. October 25, 1970, started out as a perfectly normal Sunday. Nancy and Ferris went out for a nice dinner together, enjoying the crisp autumn evening. After dinner, they drove back to Nancy's Bell Street apartment complex. They went upstairs to apartment 17, sat together, and chatted for a while, just enjoying each other's company. Eventually, Nancy grew tired and drifted off to sleep. Seeing his fiancée resting peacefully, Ferris decided it was time to head back to his own home. The clock read exactly 11:30 p.m. when Ferris stepped out of the apartment. Before he left, he made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. He left the sliding glass balcony door unlatched, cracked open just a tiny bit. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was a regular habit. Nancy always left it cracked so her cat could freely wander in and out during the night. In 1970, in a quiet Sacramento suburb, no one thought twice about leaving a balcony door unlocked. Ferris closed the main door behind him, believing he would see his future wife the very next morning. It was the last time he ever saw her alive. Sometime after midnight, while Nancy lay fast asleep, a shadow moved through the apartment complex. The killer didn't try the front door. Instead, this person targeted the second-story balcony. Investigators would later note that the killer had to be incredibly agile. They climbed up the structure, scaling the side of the building with quiet precision until they reached the second-floor ledge. The killer stepped onto Nancy's balcony and found exactly what they were looking for: the slightly open sliding glass door. With a quiet slide, the intruder stepped inside the pitch-black apartment. Nancy was completely defenseless, fast asleep in her bed, totally unaware that a monster was standing over her. What followed was a blitz attack of pure, unrestrained savagery. The killer struck with terrifying speed, plunging the blade into Nancy over 30 times. Nancy didn't give up without a fight. The presence of deep defensive wounds on her arms and hands proved that she woke up and desperately tried to shield herself from the blades, fighting for her life in the dark. but the sheer violence of the attack overcame her, leaving her nearly decapitated in a pool of blood. When the Sacramento County Sheriff's detectives arrived hours later, they immediately secured the bedroom, expecting to find the chaotic mistakes of a panicked killer. But as they dusted the room for prints, they hit a wall. There was absolutely nothing. No fingerprints on the sliding door, no prints on the furniture, and no prints on the bedroom surfaces. In 1970, latex gloves weren't readily available to the public, leading detectives to a chilling realization. The killer had premeditated this. They believed the suspect had meticulously wrapped masking tape over every single one of his fingertips before climbing that balcony, specifically to ensure he wouldn't leave a shred of identifying evidence behind. The execution of the crime seemed flawless. The killer had slipped in through a dark balcony, carried out a brutal execution, avoided leaving a single fingerprint, and was ready to vanish into the night as a ghost. He knew exactly how to avoid leaving a trace inside. But as he fled the apartment, the killer made a critical blunder. He was bleeding. The bleeding killer stepped back out onto the second-story balcony, leaving the horror of apartment 17 behind him. Nancy's desperate struggle for survival had cost him. As he began his descent, he was dripping blood, leaving a physical map of his escape route. When detectives arrived at the scene, they quickly located this trail. It started right on the balcony ledge, dropping straight down to the ground below. From there, the drops of blood formed a clear line on the concrete sidewalk. Investigators followed the red spots as they snaked away from Nancy's building, leading past two entirely separate apartment structures within the same complex. The trail finally came to an abrupt halt in the asphalt parking lot. The pattern of the final drops indicated the killer had climbed into a vehicle and sped off into the darkness, blending into the Sacramento night. Detectives carefully collected samples of the suspect's blood from the pavement. They knew this was their best piece of evidence, but they immediately ran into the harsh realities of 1970s forensic science. DNA profiling did not exist. The crime lab could only determine the killer's basic blood type. If they didn't already have a suspect to compare it to, the blood type was virtually useless for identifying a phantom. While the lab technicians analyzed the blood, a massive manhunt exploded across the city. Sacramento was gripped by pure terror. A young, innocent woman had been slaughtered in her own bed, and the public knew a highly agile killer was walking the streets. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department threw every available resource into the investigation. Within the first month alone, detectives interviewed more than 500 people. They questioned neighbors, co-workers, friends, and anyone who frequented the Bell Street area. They searched for a motive, but Nancy had absolutely no known enemies. No one had a reason to hurt her, let alone inflict that level of savagery. Despite the massive scale of the interviews, every single lead resulted in a dead end. If you are gripped by this mystery and want to make sure you don't miss how modern science finally broke this case wide open, take a second right now to hit that subscribe button and join the Retro Gang. Your support helps us keep bringing these deep dives to light. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure on the department grew immense. The case was rapidly stalling, forcing detectives to look outside the immediate circle of suspects. They began reviewing older case files, searching for anything that matched the sheer brutality of Nancy's murder. That is when they uncovered a shocking, terrifying connection. Earlier that very same year, another young woman named Judith Hikari had been murdered in the exact same area of Sacramento. When detectives placed the two case files side by side, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Both Nancy and Judith were around the exact same age. They lived just a single mile apart from each other. Most strikingly, both women were highly successful, well-liked, and were soon to be married. The media quickly seized on the terrifying pattern of a killer targeting young brides-to-be in Sacramento. The investigators were deeply shaken. They began to wonder if they were dealing with a local criminal at all, or if a much larger monster had drifted into their city. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Northern California was completely paralyzed by a hooded figure who taunted the police and randomly slaughtered young couples. The similarities were so terrifying that investigators began to ask a chilling question. Had Nancy Benallack just become the latest victim of the notorious Zodiac Killer? The terrifying theory connecting Nancy Benallack to the Zodiac Killer ultimately yielded zero physical evidence. Just like the 500 initial interviews, it led straight to another dead end. With no solid leads, no matching blood types, and a motive that remained completely blank, the roaring engine of the investigation slowly ground to a halt. The case went cold. As the months bled into years, and the years into decades, the silence around apartment 17 became deafening. For the public, the headlines faded away, replaced by new tragedies. But for Nancy's family, time stood agonizingly still. The emotional toll was devastating. Her sister Linda was left to navigate a world completely shattered by the loss of her best friend, wondering every single day who had stolen Nancy's future. The grief was uniquely brutal for her fiancé, Ferris Salome. Ferris had to continue his career as the chief public defender for the Sacramento District Court. Every single day, he walked through those same courthouse doors. He had to sit in the very courtrooms where Nancy used to work, staring at the empty spaces where she once sat typing transcripts. The courthouse became a daily reminder of the life they were supposed to build together, and the brutal reality that the monster who took her away was still walking free. Decades passed, and the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the 90s, and into a brand new millennium. The original detectives retired, passing the dusty case files down to a new generation of law enforcement. Then, in 2004, a massive flicker of hope emerged. Forensic science had completely evolved from the primitive blood typing methods of 1970. Sacramento forensic technicians revisited the preserved blood evidence gathered from the sidewalk outside Nancy's apartment. Using modern technology, they successfully extracted a full, pristine male DNA profile from the decades-old blood trail. This was supposed to be the definitive breakthrough. Investigators confidently uploaded the killer's DNA into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which houses the genetic profiles of convicted offenders across the nation. They waited for the computer to spit out a name, but the screen returned nothing. No matches, no hits. The killer had never been convicted of a violent crime that required a DNA swab. The high-tech database ran directly into a brick wall, and a crushing despair settled back over the investigation. It felt like a cruel joke. They had the killer's exact genetic code, yet he remained completely invisible. The case was permanently dead. 10 more years slipped away in total silence. By 2014, 44 years had passed since the murder. Ferris Salome was now 84 years old, his body failing him as he battled leukemia. On February 2, 2014, Ferris took his final breath and passed away. He had spent nearly half a century carrying the agonizing weight of that fateful October night, dying without ever learning the identity of the person who slaughtered his bride-to-be. It seemed the killer had won. He had successfully outlived the victim's fiancé, evaded the national DNA database, and taken his dark secrets to the grave. Until 2019, when a new team of investigators decided to use a revolutionary weapon. The exact same trap used to catch the Golden State Killer. In November 2019, a specialized team from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit and the District Attorney's Office took Nancy's case file off the shelf. CODIS had failed them, but a new forensic frontier had just opened up. They decided to utilize forensic genetic genealogy, the exact same cutting-edge investigative method that had recently captured the notorious Golden State Killer just a few miles away. Instead of looking for a direct match in a criminal database, forensic genealogists uploaded the killer's DNA profile to open-source, public genealogy websites. The goal was to find the killer's relatives, build a massive family tree, and slowly isolate the branches until they pointed to one single individual. It wasn't an overnight miracle. It was a brutal, 3-year investigative grind. Detectives spent thousands of hours tracing distant cousins, mapping out generations of families, and verifying births, marriages, and deaths. They chased leads through dusty archives and public records, steadily narrowing the circle around the phantom who had bled on the Sacramento sidewalk 52 years prior. Finally, the puzzle pieces locked into place. On July 21, 2022, the Sacramento County District Attorney stood before a room packed with reporters to deliver the announcement the world had waited more than 5 decades to hear. They had a name. The murderer of 28-year-old Nancy Marie Benallack was officially identified as Richard John Davis. The true crime community and the public braced for the standard profile of a wandering serial killer. But as the details emerged, a sickening psychological twist sent shockwaves through the room. Richard John Davis was not a drifter passing through town. He was not the Zodiac Killer operating from the shadows of Northern California. He was a 27-year-old man who lived right inside Nancy's own apartment complex on Bell Street. While Nancy lived in apartment 17, Davis lived just across the way in apartment 23. They were on opposite ends of the central courtyard pool. Every single day, Davis could look out his front window, look directly across the water, and stare at Nancy's second-story balcony. He knew her routine. He knew her habits. On that fateful October night, he didn't travel miles to find a victim. He simply walked across the pool deck, looked up at the balcony he had been watching for months, and climbed up the structure. Retired Detective Mickey Lynx would later state that the premeditation was absolute. Davis had actively planned the assault, wrapping masking tape around his fingers before he ever left his front door. Detectives strongly suspected he had developed an obsession or a crush on his neighbor, and driven by an unhinged rage after learning about her upcoming wedding, he decided to take her life. The revelation got even darker as detectives began digging through the original 1970 case files. Remember those 500 initial interviews conducted by the sheriff's department in the frantic month following the murder? The massive net that was supposed to catch the killer? As it turned out, detectives had actually walked right up to the monster's door. Within weeks of the slaughter, investigators had knocked on the door of apartment 23. They stood face to face with Richard John Davis. They questioned him extensively, and they questioned his roommate. But Davis didn't panic. He and his roommate looked the detectives in the eye and provided airtight alibis for each other for the night of October 25th. In the chaos of a massive investigation with hundreds of interviews and zero digital tracking, the roommate's confirmation was enough. The detectives checked the boxes, signed the forms, and walked away. Davis's name was buried deep in the archives, completely forgotten. Because Davis had no prior felony convictions, his only minor infraction over the decades being a single driving under the influence charge, his DNA was never required to be entered into CODIS in 2004. A simple lie to a detective in 1970 had kept him a free man for over half a century. He had lived a normal life just miles away from the horror he caused, hiding in plain sight. But when the detectives moved in to finally put handcuffs on the 52-year-old mystery, they discovered justice was just a few years too late. When the Sacramento County cold case team finally connected the genetic branches directly to Richard John Davis in 2022, they immediately prepared to make an arrest. They were ready to bring a 52-year-old ghost to justice. But as they looked up his current address, they discovered a final, frustrating dead end. Richard John Davis would never wear handcuffs. He would never stand in a courtroom, face a judge, or look Nancy's family in the eye. On November 2, 1997, at the age of 54, Davis died. The cause of death was an illness brought on by advanced, severe alcoholism. He had passed away 25 years before the DNA results ever came to light. The realization hit the investigation team with a heavy, bittersweet force. The phantom who had climbed that second-story balcony meticulously taped his fingers and savagely took the life of a young woman just weeks before her wedding had lived out the remainder of his natural life as a completely free man. He never spent a single night in a jail cell for what he did to Nancy Marie Benallack. He had gone to work, lived in the community, and carried his dark secret for 27 years after the murder, ultimately dying of natural causes. The tragic irony of the case lay entirely within the legal system Nancy had worked for. Davis's only interaction with law enforcement after 1970 was a single charge for driving under the influence. Because a DUI is not a qualifying violent felony that triggers a mandatory DNA swab for state and national databases, his genetic profile never entered CODIS in 2004. He evaded mortal justice simply by avoiding a major arrest. Retired Detective Mickey Lynx openly expressed the heavy regret felt by the department, stating to reporters that if Davis had been alive, he would have been charged immediately with first-degree premeditated murder. The cage was built, but it was completely empty. Yet, for Nancy's family, the announcement brought a profound, long-awaited shift. Nancy's sister, Linda Cox, along with her husband Tom, sat directly beside District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert during the emotional 2022 press conference. Schubert made it a point to emphasize that Nancy had never been a forgotten file. She had remained at the very top of the cold case list for 52 years. In a signed statement, Linda shared the deeply personal grief the family had carried through the decades. She spoke of how many times she and Tom had looked out over their family ranch, talking about how much Nancy would have absolutely loved the wide open spaces, the land, and the animals. They missed sharing the joys of their children and their grandchildren with her. Mortal justice had completely failed, but absolute closure had finally arrived. The mystery was gone. The family no longer had to look at strangers in Sacramento and wonder if they were looking at Nancy's killer. The truth was out in the light. If you want to ensure these forgotten victims are never truly lost to time, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Retrograde Crime to stay updated with the Retro Gang. Before you go, I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments section below. First, do you think that if Forensic Genetic Genealogy didn't exist, this crime would have ever been solved, or would Davis have remained a ghost forever? Second, what do you think about the roommate who gave Davis an alibi in 1970? Do you believe he was actively covering up a murder, or did Davis genuinely trick him too? And finally, how do you feel about the fact that Davis completely evaded legal justice by dying before he was caught? Does knowing his name bring true closure, or does the empty cage make the ending completely tragic? Drop your insights below, and stay tuned for the next video.